we've talked about these chapters, dividing them up. Where's your first division in the book of Genesis? First how many chapters? Overall.
11.
All right, you have an 11. Why? Talks about things of beginnings, right? The book of Genesis really is one that has those beginnings dealt with, of creation, of sin entering the world, of evil coming and spreading then, and then you've got the genealogies, the fact that sin had spread so much that God repented himself for making this world, and flood destroyed it. You have the Tower of Babel that divided the peoples in languages so that it would thwart their ability to get together in more and more evil. Chapter 12 makes a break. Why?
Abram is the patriarch.
Okay, Abram is the patriarch through which we're going to get the promises, or through which are given those promises of God. Threefold, what are they? Land, nation, and a seed promise that's there. You've got the seed promise that through thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed. That's not the first time Christ is brought up in veiled form. It's there in the point of the statement to the woman and the serpent in the garden, that the serpent would bruise her heel, but she would bruise its head, or the idea to put a head blow or a death blow to that serpent. And when you go from that point on, you're looking at Abraham being called, him having these promises that are restated to him. When you get into chapter 16, you have a man trying to help God out with Hagar having Ishmael, and that wasn't the child of promise. Chapter 17 gives the circumcision promise. That's something that I think we sometimes overlook the importance of in the Jewish nation, because the point of that is that they were clearing the way for the seed. And as that seed was the promise, that was an identifying mark by which it was a connection with that seed promise. So you had the circumcision being mandated at that time. When you get over the book of Galatians, if you don't understand the place that circumcision has with Abraham and with the promise, and later on demanded within the law, then you miss a large part of the book of Galatians. The point that Paul is making there is, if the seed is now come, what's the purpose of the circumcision? It has no purpose. There has come to be that seed. Now the way has been cleared, and there's a presence of this Messiah now. And so obviously the reason for that would go away, and therefore the circumcision would also go away as a commandment of God. Keep going down through this. Not only do we have Abraham, we have what other of the patriarchs? Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and from Jacob there come what? How many sons? 12, who become the 12 tribes that you're going to be dealing with. And that's going to be then the way through the rest of the Old Testament, pointing out that. Jacob's journeys and so forth, going over to get a wife and ending up with two, Rachel and Leah. In the 33rd chapter, we pointed out how that Jacob, or Israel, meets Esau in peace, the one that he had deceived before. You come down and then deal with Jacob until you get to what chapter? Main character changes when? All right, you could say 37, because that's going to be where the greatness of Joseph is pointed out. There's one more chapter, chapter 38, as you have Joseph being one who's sold into slavery. Chapter 38 comes up, you deal with Judah and Tamar, And then through the rest of the book, Joseph is the main one that you're looking at. Why? Okay, they end up in Egypt. He becomes one who not only saves his family, but who else? All right, the nation of Egypt and others around there as well, and manages the provisions. In chapter 46, you then get Jacob's journey to Egypt after Joseph has revealed himself. They settle in Goshen. What's chapter 47 about? Did that on Sunday. Okay, Pharaoh meets Joseph's family, his brethren, and also Israel, or Jacob. And Joseph has a wise handling of the arrangements there, of the business in Egypt. And as a result of that, Pharaoh is enriched and caused to pretty much own the whole of Egypt. Chapter 48, Jacob blesses Joseph's sons. What did he do when he blessed them? All right, crossed his hands over. Where have you seen that before? Pretty much. Same effect, not the same tactic of crossing hands. All right, what you had with Jacob and Esau. That there, the younger is the one who would be the ruler over the older. And here you have that same thing. Manasseh, the one who gets the place of predominance or leadership. All right, Ephraim does. And when you have the division of the kingdom, sometimes Israel is referred to as Ephraim. The reason is that's where they're having the main seat of government. That's the place where there's the real power that comes from the northern kingdom. And so that's what it's looked at. Chapter 49, what happens there? Most Bibles, you have it printed up as kind of a poem, a verse that's there. What's it about? All right. You have this words concerning the sons of Jacob. And then his death vow that said, when I die, you take me back unto the land of my forefathers and bury him in the cave of Machpelah. Chapter 50, what happens then? Say that again? I couldn't hear.
Burial of Jacob.
Okay. All right. We have Jacob's burial. Joseph doing what? Forgiving his brother. Why? Okay. All right. They go and say to him, now, Daddy said you were supposed to forgive us. Actually, they are ones who are very concerned that he might take his revenge. But he had absolutely no intent of that, obvious, because he said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. He could see what happened as a result of that. That's something where you look at the providence of God is recognized in these places. But another thing, as we pointed out before, and I want to stress, is that in order for us to be used to further God's cause, what do we have to do? We have to be prepared to be that kind of people that are used in the service of God. Had Joseph been one who was not a righteous man and had allowed himself to succumb to Potiphar's wife, he couldn't have been used then. He would have been a man that would have just thought about himself and tried to get revenge. He wouldn't have done the good that he did. All of these things are there. God uses Joseph because Joseph was prepared to be used. And that's something we need to think about in our life. We cannot take over the providence of God, nor can I tell you exactly what happens in it. I might suspect it sometime, but short of it being revealed, I don't know. However, what I can do is ready my life to be used by God in that sort of way. Even though it was for the detriment of Joseph for a long time, it seemed. In the end, it worked out for that which is best. And that's what Joseph was looking at. Go ahead.
That's what I was going to say. He was patient because he spent a lot of time suffering, even though he was innocent.
Right. Okay, now, last part of that, as we noted, Joseph's death is there. What did he command? Do what? All right, to be buried back there, to have him be brought back to the cave of Machpelah as well, which is exactly what they did. However, he was embalmed in Egypt and put into the sarcophagus that I think everybody knows what that is. You've seen some of that with the Ramses exhibit and King Tut and all of that. But those kind of ornate coffin type things where they would put the embalmed party, he was ready to do, or he was then ready to go back to the promised land whenever that was to be done. All right, anybody else got anything there? Go ahead.
I have a question. Do you know why most of the time when names were changed in the scriptures, from then on out it's used, Abram to Abraham and, Sarai to Sarah. But with Jacob, his name was changed to Israel, and it was they still referenced him as Jacob. Is there a reason that was different?
I don't know. I've read several things on that. I see nothing from the scripture that would tell me that. What I do notice, however, is that Jacob still does not, even after the time where the name has been changed, it's changed for the cause as a whole, the overview of God's people. But he does not act like the strength of God. In that particular case of the wrestling, no doubt that's why it was given. But in the rest of his life, you see him goofing up quite a bit until you come to this point. At the last, Hebrews 11 affirms to us that in his latter days he worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. So there seems to have been some good things said about the end and pointed out here. But by and large, his works or his actions with Tamar and other things make me kind of wonder whether that was done of him continuing to be Jacob because he's continuing to act like Jacob rather than the strength of God. I don't know. All right, anybody else?
Was there any repercussion farther down the road for him noticing what Reuben had done? He's mentioned in the prophecy, but it don't know if it says that he knew about it and then nothing.
What we're going to see is that Reuben, each time you would think that he would be the oldest and would have some place of leadership, but he does not. And when they come into the land, it's about the last time we hear much about Reuben. And he just kind of goes away and really doesn't have much to do with leadership one way or another. All right. Now, let's go on to have the review of Genesis. 1 Corinthians 10, I want you to consider this passage when we talk about why was the Old Testament given. Now, these things became an example to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages have come. All right. Now, what are those specific cases, those actions, where are they taken from? Not taken from Genesis, are they? Where are they taken from? All right, you've got the wilderness wandering that is here. We studied that in some detail here a few years ago. But that's where they're taken from. And each time, what happened generally? People did something, and that something was evil. And what happened?
God punished them.
All right, God punished them. What does that tell you?
God punishes evil.
All right, that's the nature of it. He cannot tolerate that. There has to be a punishment. To understand the justice of God, we have to go back to the Old Testament. If we fail to understand in the Old Testament, principles are established every time. When people do wrong, there is a consequence to that wrong. Now, does God sometimes pardon? Yes, He does. But when you recognize the point, God condemns that which is against His will. And so, when there is a betrayal of God, an action that is against His very nature and kind, then there has to be a punishment that's there. What else does it tell you?
He fulfills his promises.
Do what?
What else does the Old Testament tell you, or this?
Yeah, about these specific ones, these examples, what else do they tell you?
Nothing new under the sun.
Okay. What else? Does He always punish the same way? No. There are a number of ways that you can see things happening. Are all of the punishments immediate in their action? No. Are some of them immediate? Yes. And if you look at it in this particular number of them, which is more? That it's immediate in the way that's being done. Now, when you go through that, I also want you to notice this phrase. Tell me what this means. He says, don't commit the sexual immorality as some of them did, and one day 23,000 fell, nor let us tempt, what? Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents.
Wasn't that the same event?
Okay. And what happened when they were destroyed by the serpents? What had they done? There was this sin that was there with regard to the sexual immorality that was involved. There was also, what else? The blasphemy that was involved. Now, where did someone say, I'm bringing shame upon the Christ, or I am opposed to the Christ? Can you see the word Christ, or the Hebrew equivalent Messiah, in any of that context? Can't see the word. So why does Paul then say, nor let us tempt Christ?
Showing the deity of Christ.
All right, he's showing the deity of Christ. Christ is involved in that which is being done there. And what happens if we turn away from Christ and His will, the gospel today? We're just like them in a time of condemnation in that way. What happens if someone goes into immorality? That's an action against who? It's an action ultimately against Christ. What did Joseph say with regard to Potiphar's wife? How can I do this evil against God and against your husband as well? But the sin against God, when we recognize that fornication and adultery are sins because they are an affront to the very face of God. that is a blasphemy of God, if you will. It's a sin against him. Now, I want you to think through that a little bit deeper. Why? Why is that a sin against God? It's me and that other person that's involved, right? How does God fit into this equation?
Breaking of a blood covenant.
Okay. Who binds a man and a woman together? God does in marriage. That's the only rightful place that there is any sexual union. And so now, if I act outside of that, either before that marriage or outside of the extramarital side of that, either way, who am I sinning against first? Sinning against God. When Christ said, "For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, they two shall become flesh." What? God therefore joined together what? Let no man put asunder. That's the charge of Christ. When we violate that, who are we sinning against? Christ. Does that mean we aren't sinning against the Father or the Holy Spirit? Nope. When you get over in the book of 1 Corinthians a little bit further, it shows in chapter 6 that fornication is also a sin that's there toward the Holy Spirit. It's a sin against the God who made us. So when you look at this all together, sometimes people fail to get an idea of what sin is because they don't understand who it hurts. And who sin hurts first and foremost is God. Doesn't matter whether we lie about someone or we have a sexual union with someone we have no right to or whatever else. The sin is against God. And when we keep that in our mind, what happens? It's a little bit more serious. It's not just a temporal consequence. This is an affront to the very deity that made us. All right, anything else there? Now that leads to the next passage, Romans 15:4. For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. We had a sermon on this not long ago. But whatever was written before is talking about what? The Old Testament. They were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of what? Of the Scriptures might have hope. So we're supposed to learn something from the Old Testament, right? What will that then enhance? That'll enhance our patience and comfort, and it'll lead us towards what? Our hope. So does anything that the Old Testament has to say, can we say, well, that doesn't matter. That's all Old Testament stuff. Let's just forget about that. No need to study that. When I was first starting out preaching in East Texas, that was the attitude of a number of people where I went. And a lot of times I would have lessons from the Old Testament, some of the meetings around there. And I would always catch one or two old folks that would come along and they'd say, why are you studying? Why are you preaching from the Old Testament? The Old Testament doesn't matter. We're not under the Old Testament. We're under the New Testament. And I hear those kind of things over and over and over again. And it just makes me wonder, have you ever read these passages? What is it about the Old Testament that we're supposed to learn if we're not even supposed to look at it? And how is it that if it doesn't have any place for us, how is it that it gives us patience and it gives us comfort and it leads us to our hope? You see very clearly we need to study the Old Testament. Now, somebody might say we study too much of it at one particular time or another. That's a matter I'm going to let the elders determine and go whatever way it is that they're going to suggest about content. But the fact of it is we have, by and large, a lack of understanding of the Old Testament that is present among far too many members of the church today, not an overemphasis of the Old Testament. And so we look at the things and we recognize the principles. All right. Now, when you look at the outline that's here in Genesis, I'm showing this outline for a reason that we're going to have next, starting out. You deal with the creation, the fall, the flood, the nations, their development, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. You have these points that are made throughout there. It's pointing out how God promises his people to be redeemed, how he's leading up to that. You have the picture of the seed of the woman in 3:15, the Melchizedek, the high priest that's talked about in the book of Hebrews in Genesis 14:18, the humiliation and exaltation of Joseph that prefigures the Christ as well. You have the promises that are given to Abraham that talk about this threefold promise that then becomes the basic guide path, I guess you would say, the golden thread through the rest of the Old Testament. Now, thinking about all of that in the book of Genesis, I want to know something. What principles are taught in Genesis that we should learn? If it's written for our learning, for our admonition, as 1 Corinthians chapter 10 put it, what are the principles that are fundamental that we learn? The book Genesis means what? Beginnings. When you begin with something, you usually get some instruction with it, right? What do we learn about the beginnings from the book of Genesis? Starting out what? All right, creation. Why do we need to know about the creation? We weren't alive back then. So what's the big deal?
Shows God's power.
All right. God's power in it. Is there anything that you notice in the first chapter about how God created the heavens and the earth and all that in it is? Is there anything that helps you to see something about God and the way he does things?
He said it was good.
All right. It's good. Day 6, he finishes the creation of man, and what does he say? It's very good. How's that fit with those who say we were created with these instincts of evil? Doesn't work, does it? Some would come along and say, okay, we weren't created that way then. It's changed at the time of the fall. If God created us good, are you going to tell me he's going to then turn around and allow either somebody else to overrule his creation to make them inherently evil, or that God's going to change his will and make us evil? That doesn't make any sense either, right? We need to start out with that fundamental point that when we were made in the image of God. There wasn't a mistake there. There wasn't something lacking. God made us exactly as he intended to make us. What else do we learn in the beginnings? Go ahead.
Godhead.
Okay. Larry, behind first.
I see in many ways the long suffering of God, and at the same time he maintains his justice.
Okay.
But you see that blend where he's very long suffering with us.
Okay.
That's
Let's
encouraging.
back up for a minute. Further back in the book of Genesis, before we get out of the first couple of chapters, what else do we see a beginning point of?
Well, God sets rules, and we have to follow them, and if we don't, there's going to be a consequence. And
Okay.
if we do, there's a blessing.
Okay. What else?
God's plan of salvation is set in motion.
Okay. Certainly a set in motion there. What else?
We had free choice. We didn't choose to follow God.
Okay. Have free will.
Well, the concept of time, because before that, time is irrelevant before the beginning, it's eternity. So it wasn't until he says in the beginning,
You know any reason by some physical science that there are 7 days in a week? Is there any science behind that that would say there's 7 days a week because this particular thing happens and that completes in 7 days? Not a thing. Why have we universally had 7 days in a week? As far back as you can go. There you have it. You have a beginning that's pointed out. He created them male and female. And what did he say about mankind being created male and female? He began another institution there. What? Marriage. Do you have to find the definition of marriage in the New Testament? It's given in the Old Testament. Question. Could you find the definition of marriage as it is in the New Testament? No, except for in Matthew 19, where Jesus quotes Genesis 2. When you're talking about the beginning, you're seeing that. Points that both JT in his lessons and myself and others have noted repeatedly. The idea of what is the shame of nakedness and how that is something that is precluded. Clothing that's proper is also pointed out in the book of Genesis. When you start going through the book of Genesis, you have a lot of beginnings. The nature of these things a lot of times are not described. If you had to describe God and his power, and you couldn't possibly use the book of Genesis, how well would you do? It's one of those things when the communist wall fell and we went in behind it. One of the things I was asked several times by people was they had lived under Soviet domination for 70 years of official atheism. And they said, when you use that word God, what do you mean? And the more I thought about that, I went back to what we taught Chris and Ryan growing up. You know, it was, you had to start back at the fundamentals. Well, any of you have had children growing up, where do you usually start to explain God? God the Creator. I don't know any better way to do that. Any kind of help that I've ever seen from others in bringing along things have started with God as Creator. You've got to explain, why are we here? How did we get here? All of those kind of things. Go ahead.
I think another point about that is, unlike a lot of the things that are in the Old Testament, that being the beginning, especially when you're young, are things that you can see now. You know, they're all relatable, even to young, you know, very young child or something about the world. You know, you can see the sky and the earth and the animals, and so it's something that's relatable to even children. You know, when you start talking about kings and armies and things like that, they may not have any, they don't really know what that is, they don't see that, you know.
A lot of people today will come along, especially those who are kind of agnostic, and say, well, I just don't believe that God would destroy the earth. And I had a fellow tell me that one time, and I said, you mean again? And the idea of a flood, telling us that's exactly what happened. You have the various things that are there. When you get to the New Testament, the principles that you need in order to come to Christ, you've got from that. That's why Paul called it a tutor to bring us to Christ. Is that through that Old Testament, you have these things that carry us along. When you look at the character studies, most of us, when we start teaching our children, start with character studies after the general creation and all of those kind of things. But we start with characters. And what do? Kids learn characters because they see what's good and what's bad, why we ought to do what's good and how we ought not to do what's bad. That's a simple way of teaching with children. Well, what's chapters 12 through 50 of the book of Genesis? Exactly. Can you see things that come along overall? Can you see things that come along of problems in mankind that we have today that they didn't have back then? I'm not talking about technology. I'm talking about in principle. The ecclesiastical writer said, there isn't any new thing under the sun, and there's really not. We can do the same sins lots of different ways, and that changes over time, but it's still the same sin. And we can obey God by the use of many different things we have today, but it's still the same, in essence, obedience of God that are there. I can fly an airplane over to the Philippines to preach, or Paul could go there walking on foot or on ship or whatever else. It doesn't change any. It's the same message. And so when you've got these things from the Old Testament, it tells us about the beginnings. Without the book of Genesis, we're lost in knowing any of the rest of the Bible. It's what puts that foundation, that first step in the stairway to learning to come to the Christ. All right, anybody got anything there? Yeah? I'm like, I didn't even get to talk about that. I'm like, Kurt, here's your question. So, anyway, we don't have time to go over them because they're about to flash me on. But the fact of it is, if you have any problems with those, let me know. And we can go over any you might have a desire to do.